Hello everyone. First of all, let me thank you for taking the time to hear this podcast. My name is Joana Sanchovaj, and this podcast is an overview of the report Financing Opportunities for EU SMEs Internationalisation in Japan, a result of a research conducted under the Policy and Market Intelligence Program of the EU-Japan Center for Industrial Cooperation, a joint venture between the European Commission and the Japanese government. The aim of this podcast is to help users finding their way through the report, as well as summing up the key findings of the conducted research. The full report is available at the EU Japan Center's webpage. In this podcast, I will talk about the relevance of the topic, the aims and objectives of the report, as well as present three key findings in regard to the availability of financing support in the European Union and in Japan. Finally, I will present the main conclusions and explain some of the given recommendations to the EU Japan Center and policymakers. So, why did I conduct this research in the first place? I would say for three reasons. First, internationalization of EU SMEs beyond the internal market is crucial for EU competitiveness, and Japan specifically is perceived as a growth market with increased importance for EU businesses, namely following the signature of the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure. Second, startups and SMEs often lack own capital to finance what's needed to enter distant markets, but also face greater obstacles than bigger companies in accessing external financing. In a demanding market such as Japan, access to finance becomes even more relevant. And third, despite the availability of financing support, as a result of the complexity of financial matters and the fragmentation of information across several sources, SMEs seem to be highly unaware of the opportunities that are available for them. In this sense, and striving to fill this gap, this report draws on desk review and interviews conducted to nearly 60 stakeholders and experts across the EU and Japan, such as the European Commission, the EIB, as well as JETRO and JBIC, among many others. And the main aim was to provide an overview on the availability of financing support for EU-based businesses who wish to internationalize into the Japanese market. Therefore, the research is conducted across two geographies: the origin market, the European Union, and the destination market, Japan, from which the two chapters of the report arise. So, the first chapter of the report is the result of the research conducted at the EU level, and the second chapter of the report is the result of the research conducted at the Japan level. Each one of the chapters provides a comprehensive analysis on the availability of financing support, as well as a mapping of relevant stakeholders and financing support initiatives. The lists of relevant stakeholders and initiatives in the EU and Japan are available under Annexes 1 to 7. The results of the report are then comprised by the key findings of the research conducted across the EU and Japan, of course, as well as by the identification of actionable insights, which will be presented in the form of recommendations to the EU-Japan Center and policymakers. These recommendations can also be relevant to business support organizations who wish to improve the capacity of their services for the internationalization of SMEs beyond the EU. Let's begin with the first chapter. The EU institutions offer several funding and financing opportunities for small businesses. However, the multiplicity of support programs, instruments, and stakeholders makes the financing support landscape very complex. This chapter thus begins to identify the main trends and shortcomings in the EU approach to SMEs internationalization financing. Considering that many EU-backed instruments are made available to SMEs through financial intermediaries, it proceeds with the clarification of the role of institutions and intermediaries, such as the EIB and national and regional promotional banks, in the delivery of financial instruments. Finally, it overviews the current EU funds and programs in terms of scope and target priorities in order to understand which of these instruments are suitable for internationalization beyond the EU and how can EU SMEs access them. From this overview, a list of suitable instruments and relevant stakeholders is provided under Annexes 1 to 5. The key takeaways of the research conducted at the EU level can be summed up into three topics. First, challenges and barriers to SMEs' access to financing opportunities in the EU. Second, provision of EU-backed financial instruments to EU SMEs. And third, suitability of EU initiatives for internationalization beyond the EU. As for the first one, challenges and barriers to SMEs' access to financing opportunities in the EU, I think it's worth to highlight four main barriers and the Commission's response to them. So, with the sustainability of EU funds at stake, the European Commission has been promoting a more extensive use of blended finance, which is grants plus debt or equity-based financial instruments, in view of leveraging capital from private sources. As EU SMEs find it difficult to get loans from commercial banks, the EU Commission offers guarantee and risk-sharing tools to financial intermediaries, for example, commercial banks at the local level, in view of increasing their own capability of providing themselves for SMEs. More innovative and fast-growing SMEs and startups find the current financial instruments offered by commercial banks unsuited for their needs. Following its 2020 SME strategy, the European Commission is currently encouraging and financially supporting the development of more innovative solutions for SMEs finance, such as blockchain technology-based solutions, for example. And finally, as a result of the fragmentation of information on financing opportunities across stakeholders, EU SMEs are highly unaware of the EU-backed opportunities that are available for them. In view of addressing this challenge, the next MFF will integrate all financial instruments into the same umbrella program, InvestEU, and this will enable an increased harmonization of rules and procedures, as well as provide a one-stop solution for the access of financial instruments. As for the second topic, referring to the provision of EU-backed financial instruments to EU SMEs, well, most of EU-backed programs are managed by the European Investment Bank Group on behalf of the Commission. The EIB's business model relies on the delivery of financial instruments to selected financial intermediaries such as national promotional banks, commercial banks, etc., which are then responsible for finding final beneficiaries for the Commission's products. As a rule of thumb, the European Investment Bank Group does not provide direct debt or equity to SMEs, and therefore most of instruments can only be accessed at home via local financial intermediaries. If you look at the image that is on the presentation, you can see that national promotional banks and institutions can act as financial intermediaries or as financial partners. When acting as financial intermediaries, mostly they find final beneficiaries for instruments that are provided to them by the European Investment Bank. When they act as financial partners, they provide instruments to financial intermediaries selected by them or directly to SMEs. The main difference is that when they act as financial partners, they have to go through a process of pillar assessment, and then they are able to tailor their own instruments and suit them to the local needs. This is basically the biggest difference. As for the last topic of the first chapter, referring to the suitability of EU initiatives for internationalization beyond the EU, well, considering the specific criteria of internationalization beyond the EU, four EU-backed programs stand out: InnovWide, COSME, Horizon Europe, and EIC Accelerator. InnovWide is an Horizon 2020 program that provides grants to the internationalization of selected EU SMEs worldwide, including both low-income and high-income countries such as Japan. The last call of the program is now closed. However, the program is expected to continue, even if under a different structure or name. It's therefore recommended that EU SMEs keep a close eye on this. COSME, in turn, is the only EU program exclusively focused in supporting the internationalization of EU SMEs through financial instruments. It offers both debt and equity instruments to EU SMEs through national, local financial intermediaries. In order to access these instruments, EU SMEs should reach out to COSME's financial intermediaries in their home country. Horizon 2020 provides both debt guarantees and equity for promising innovative projects through selected financial intermediaries. For the period 2021 and 2027, its financial instruments will be integrated into Horizon Europe. Finally, the EIC Accelerator supports highly innovative and close-to-market SMEs through grants or through blended finance, comprising grants and equity. Proceeding to the second chapter, which is focused on the Japanese market, the report explores financing opportunities related to EU-Japan collaboration with reference to the Connectivity Agreement and the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the EIB and JBIC, NEXI and JICA, as well as the availability of financing support provided by Japanese institutions themselves. Proceeding from here, it drills down into the private level in an effort to map out other financing opportunities offered by private investors. The key takeaways of the research conducted at the Japanese level can be summed up into three topics. First, EU-Japan connectivity and co-financing opportunities between the EIB and Japanese institutions. Second, availability of financing support for EU SMEs provided by Japanese institutions within and outside of Japan. And third, availability of private capital in Japan. As for the first topic, besides the Economic Partnership Agreement, the EU and Japan have signed an agreement on quality infrastructure and connectivity. Following a global demand for infrastructure, this agreement expresses diplomatic savvy if understood in the light of other important events, such as the One Belt One Road infrastructure strategy pursued by Beijing and the US-led Blue Dot network. The so-called Connectivity Agreement is expected to facilitate EU-Japan business cooperation in third countries, a trend that has been gaining relevance among EU businesses, with Japan being increasingly perceived as a gateway to other markets, namely in Asia. The financing arm for connectivity is found in the MOUs signed between the EIB and Japanese institutions, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, the Nippon Export and Investment Insurance, NEXI, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. Throughout the discussion, some priority sectors for co-financing between the EU and Japan have already been identified, and these include renewable energy and new technologies such as hydrogen and offshore wind technology, for example. It's important to note, however, that as a high-income country, Japan is not included in the EIB's countries of operation. This means that co-financing between the EIB and Japanese institutions is likely to occur in the EIB's countries of operation, mostly developing countries. Even though these MOUs express a common framework for action between the EU and Japan, they do not constitute binding agreements, and thus far no operational outcomes have been produced, mostly due to the prevalence of some technical constraints that are further explored in the report. However, this does not mean that co-financing between the EIB and Japanese institutions is currently not possible. In fact, this has happened in the past. The EIB and Japanese institutions can still agree to finance the same project in the EIB's countries of operation, most likely with both of them signing an agreement with a third party. As for financing support for EU SMEs provided by Japanese institutions, it seems relevant to highlight that Japanese institutions are often tied up with Japanese financing requirements that are often hard to meet by EU SMEs. They are therefore unlikely to provide financing for EU SMEs unless there is a Japanese company involved. Cases of individual investments in foreign companies are thus rare, with most of investments overseas being, in fact, joint investments between a Japanese institution and a Japanese acquirer. Partnering up with a Japanese company seems to be the key to access financial instruments offered by Japanese institutions. With regard to the availability of private capital in Japan, the conducted research observes two main trends. First, the relevance of Japanese trading houses who have subsidiaries all over the world and are active worldwide investors, notably in startups as means of outsourcing R&D, and the R&D spending by the private sector, which is very significant in Japan. This graph from the Statistics Bureau of Japan shows that the expenditure by business enterprises in 2019 was significantly higher when compared with the spendings from universities and public organizations, for example. This contrasts with the overall tendency in Europe, where the research and investment expenditures come mostly from universities. As for the industrial sector is concerned, the Statistics Bureau of Japan observes that transportation equipment collected the highest expenditures amount, with medicines and electrical machinery, equipment and supplies also ranking high among all industries. As for startups specifically, not least important is the strong support from the Japanese government for the creation and attraction of startups through several initiatives, with special reference, for example, to the startup visa system, but also the drastic reversal of VC investment composition towards early stage investments. As the young startup ecosystem in Japan blooms, and whereas corporate venture capital is still extremely significant, some specialized funds willing to invest overseas start coming up. Even though the US seems to be the main target market for Japanese investors still, their interest in EU startups seems to be growing. Drivers of this interest are, for example, the saturation of Silicon Valley, but also some common policy concerns between the EU and Japan that forcibly create some sector-focused convergence. As an example, EU startups providing solutions to ongoing challenges that can also be observed in Japan, such as the aging population, for example, are likely to have an added value in the Japanese market as well. Notwithstanding this growing interest, this report also draws the attention to EU policymakers for some barriers identified throughout the interviews with Japanese investors that might be hampering the attraction of investment from Japanese VCs and CVCs. Identified obstacles include, for example, the fragmentation of the continent and language barriers that make it hard for investors to take advantage of the EU population as a whole, but also the absence of networks in the EU by Japanese investors and ineffective pitch decks by European startups. Besides the specific findings with regard to the availability of financing support in the EU and Japan, a generic conclusion can be taken out of the overall research. That conclusion is that the wide range of EU initiatives aimed at increasing EU SMEs' competitiveness is not sized by EU SMEs, who are highly unaware of the opportunities available for them. Not disregarding other reasons that could also be mentioned, two important barriers that result in lack of awareness and that are worth to be highlighted are unobserved little expertise in financing for internationalization outside of the internal market, and the fragmentation of information about potential financing sources across multiple stakeholders. Even though business support organizations in third markets are often referred as contact points for information about financing opportunities, the truth is that these organizations themselves have no full overview on the available initiatives or specific expertise in financial matters most of the times. In view of bridging this gap, some recommendations to increase SMEs' awareness on financing opportunities are provided in the report. These recommendations include increasing information sharing between the European Commission with relevant stakeholders, notably with European business organizations located in third countries, who, due to their proximity to EU SMEs, can act as relevant multipliers of information, and widening the geographical outreach of the European Investment Advisory Hub, whose expertise is currently focused on the internal market, to include financing advice for internationalization in third markets. As for the EU-Japan Center, the recommendations include a proposal for the implementation of a EU SME finance help desk, providing advisory and facilitation services to support SMEs' access to suitable financing opportunities through two working groups. The EU Working Group on Finance, composed by potential financing providers, and the EU-Japan Interinstitutional Working Group, with a focus on financing opportunities for EU-Japan collaboration in third markets. The latter should, among others, facilitate a close follow-up with the EIB on the discussions related to the MOU signed with JBIC, NEXI and JICA, and the organization of joint seminars with Japanese institutions, notably a seminar on financing opportunities that should include a matchmaking event. Other recommendations include the establishment of a venture capital network aimed at connecting EU SMEs with private capital in Japan, and the creation of active partnerships with governmental and non-governmental trade promotion organizations, adopting a multiplayer strategy to ensure the outreach of the EU Japan Center's services to EU SMEs, and namely to the ones that have no operations in Japan yet. I hope I was able to provide a clear overview or a short version of the report on financing opportunities for EU SMEs internationalization in Japan. The full report is available at the EU Japan Center's webpage and can be accessed through the link or the QR code that I have included in this presentation. Thank you very much for hearing this podcast, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me through the email that I have included in the report. Thank you again.